Along the Nile, years arrive without ceremony, slipping past like water itself, rising and falling patiently, noticed only through soil, color, and timing, while empires fade upstream and downstream, irrelevant to the river's quiet persistence, across centuries unbothered and unchanged. Many listen quietly here, night after night. If this calm travels with you, you may stay. Subscribing keeps this silence alive. Now, rest. The river that measured time without words. Time along the Nile was not counted in symbols or declared by turning pages. It was absorbed quietly through repetition, learned by watching water behave the way it always had. Farmers did not ask which year had arrived. They watched the river's surface, the color of its edge, the pace of its rise. Time revealed itself through patience rather than numbers, through waiting rather than marking. The river rose when it always rose, slowly enough to feel familiar, steadily enough to be trusted. It did not hurry to announce itself. It expanded across banks with the confidence of something that had done this before and expected to do it again. Villages did not react with surprise. They adjusted their posture, their pace, their expectations. This adjustment was the measurement of time. No one stood on the shore counting days. They counted depth by stones already known, by marks left by earlier seasons. Water touched one stone, then another. Each touch carried memory without words. When the water stopped rising, bodies recognized it before minds tried to interpret it. Fields waited because they had learned to wait. Calendars existed somewhere, but they were not persuasive. Ink could not compete with mud on ankles or the weight of baskets pressing into shoulders. Time moved through muscles and skin, not through records. The Nile taught accuracy by being accurate. It returned when expected. It withdrew when expected. That reliability shaped how people thought without ever asking them to think about it. Between 300 and 400 AD, empires shifted names and borders, but the river did not alter its behavior in response. The Nile did not acknowledge administration. It acknowledged gravity, rainfall far upstream, and the shape of land it had already memorized. Farmers learned that stability did not require attention. It required repetition. The year unfolded through sensation: cool water against calves, warm mud drying under sun, the smell of silt settling. These cues arrived in sequence, forming a timeline the body understood instinctively. The river did not explain itself. Explanation would have been inefficient. Instead, it demonstrated. Children learn time by watching adults prepare. When tools were cleaned, when storage was checked, when fields were left untouched because water had not yet done its work, instruction happened without lessons. The river set the curriculum. Everyone followed it quietly. There is mild irony in how modern minds struggle to imagine this. We expect time to be loud, numbered, announced. Along the Nile, time preferred subtlety. It slipped past in familiar motions. A year felt like another year because it behaved like another year. Difference was not denied, but it was small enough to ignore. The river's rise did not signal urgency. It signaled permission. Permission to wait. Permission to pause. Permission to trust that preparation would be rewarded without needing acceleration. Fields absorbed water slowly. Seeds waited beneath surface. Waiting did not feel empty. It felt correct. When water receded, no one celebrated the date. They noticed texture instead. Mud thick enough to hold footprints. ground soft enough to accept planting. These conditions mattered more than any count of days. Time here was actionable only when it changed behavior. Hands remembered patterns older than stories. When to move livestock, when to repair tools, when to stand still and let water decide. The river carried authority without enforcing it. Authority came from consistency rather than command. There is something deeply calming about a system that does not require interpretation. The Nile did not ask whether this was a good year or a bad one. It presented conditions. People responded. Response replaced reflection. Reflection could wait until evening. Even disputes bent to this rhythm. Arguments paused when water rose. Decisions waited until land reappeared. The river organized attention without instruction. What could not be done was postponed. What could be done was done without haste. The Nile measured time without words by shaping consequences. Plant too early, and water would undo the effort. Plant too late, and soil would harden. These lessons repeated annually until they no longer felt like lessons. They felt like common sense. Memory formed differently here. People remembered sequences rather than dates. First rise, full spread, slow withdrawal. Each stage carried expectations. Expectation reduced anxiety. Anxiety thrives where unpredictability dominates. The river offered predictability generously. There is gentle humor in how little this system cared about human milestones. Births happened. Deaths happened. The river continued. It did not adjust volume for grief or joy. That indifference did not feel cruel. It felt stabilizing. Between centuries, nothing dramatic announced change. The river did not mark transitions between eras. It marked seasons through behavior. This continuity softened the impact of political shifts. When rulers changed, water did not. Farmers noticed. Time here felt circular without being repetitive. Each cycle resembled the last but carried subtle variation. Variation did not demand commentary. It was absorbed quietly. Too much water meant adaptation. Too little meant adjustment. Neither required panic. The Nile also taught restraint. It punished excess effort. Overworking fields before the flood wasted energy. Waiting preserved strength. Strength mattered more than ambition. The river rewarded patience consistently enough that impatience lost appeal. Late-night history lingers here because nothing insists on attention. There are no proclamations, no decisive moments, just water behaving as expected and people shaping their lives around that expectation. Time becomes something you live inside rather than observe from outside. At night, the river sounded the same as it always had. Soft movement, gentle contact with banks, no announcement of progress. Darkness did not interrupt its work. It continued unseen. Time continued unseen as well. Villages slept without calculating tomorrow's date. They trusted the river to indicate what mattered when morning arrived. Trust reduced mental weight. Reduced weight preserved energy. Energy preserved community. There is understated irony in how accurately this system measured time while refusing to name it. Precision existed without numbers. Order existed without calendars. The river kept track so people did not have to. As centuries passed, this unspoken measurement remained intact. Techniques adjusted. Tools changed slightly. But the core rhythm persisted. The Nile carried time forward like sediment, layering experience without erasing what lay beneath. The river did not hurry, it did not delay. It moved at its own pace, which happened to be sustainable. Sustainability did not require explanation, it required repetition. Even those who traveled away returned with the same expectations. They looked for familiar signs. They trusted water over words. Time resumed its shape around them easily. Late-night history finds rest in this certainty. A year that does not ask to be remembered still shapes memory deeply. The Nile measured time without words, and because of that, time felt lighter. Nothing needed emphasis. Nothing needed recording. The river did its work. People responded. Years passed without asking permission. And in that quiet exchange, life continued, uncounted yet precisely known, guided by water that remembered everything necessary without ever saying a word. Flooding as routine, not drama. Flooding along the Nile did not arrive as a shock, and it was not treated as a miracle. It arrived the way a familiar visitor arrives, without needing introduction, without demanding reaction. People had been expecting it for months, not as an event, but as a phase. Channels were cleared ahead of time, banks were repaired, where they always weakened. Paths were adjusted quietly. Preparation was not emotional. It was procedural. When water finally reached the fields, it did not interrupt life. It confirmed that life was proceeding as planned. The flood fulfilled a role rather than creating a moment. It was not framed as danger or blessing. Those interpretations belonged to stories told later, far from the river itself. On the ground, flooding meant a change in posture and movement. Feet stepped into boats instead of onto paths. Hands rested from plowing and turned to maintenance. Fields did not fail. They waited. Waiting was not seen as loss. It was seen as alignment. There was no celebration when the water arrived, because celebration implied surprise. Surprise did not exist here. There was also no fear, because fear requires uncertainty. The flood's timing and behavior were familiar enough to remove suspense. Water rose to known levels, covered known ground, and slowed when it always slowed. The river did not rush. Neither did the people. Urgency would have wasted energy. Energy was better conserved. Flooding reorganized labor without erasing it. Work shifted rather than stopped. Tasks moved closer to homes and storage areas. Boats replaced walking, but movement continued. Grain already harvested was protected. Tools were cleaned and repaired. Nets were checked. Roofs were inspected. The flood created a different kind of productivity, one less visible, but no less necessary. Children adapted easily. They learned to balance in boats as naturally as they had learned to walk on dry ground. For them, flooding did not feel disruptive. It felt seasonal. Adults adjusted schedules without complaint. No one asked how long the flood would last. That question had already been answered by experience. Answers lived in memory, not conversation. The river's expansion did not demand attention beyond what was required. People did not gather to watch it dramatically. They noticed it the way one notices weather settling in. Awareness replaced observation. Observation implies distance. Awareness implies participation. Flooding was something one lived inside, not something one stood apart from. Between 300 and 400 AD, political authority shifted often enough to confuse those who paid attention to it. Flooding ignored these changes completely. It arrived whether decrees were issued or not. This consistency offered reassurance. When external structures felt unstable, the river's behavior remained dependable. Dependability reduced anxiety more effectively than any promise. There is gentle irony in how later narratives describe floods as moments of crisis or transformation. From within the experience, they were neither. They were routine. Routine does not inspire dramatic language. It inspires acceptance. Acceptance allowed communities to endure variations without overreacting. Water-covered paths that would soon reappear. People did not mourn their temporary disappearance. They knew where they were. Memory filled the gaps. This trust, in return, shaped behavior. When nothing feels permanently lost, patience becomes easier. Houses were built with this in mind. Storage was raised. Thresholds were known. Flooding did not enter spaces it had not entered before. When it did, adjustments were made calmly. No one interpreted this as failure. It was information. Information guided future repairs. Sound changed during flooding. The slap of water replaced footsteps. Voices carried differently. These changes were not unsettling. They signaled adaptation. Adaptation was expected. Silence did not imply absence. It implied alignment with conditions. Work rhythms slowed slightly, but not because people lacked motivation. They slowed because water imposes its own pace. Fighting that pace would have exhausted bodies unnecessarily. The river rewarded those who matched it. Matching did not require speed. It required timing. Fields beneath water were not considered idle. They were resting. Rest here was productive. Silt settled. Nutrients distributed themselves without instruction. The land did work invisibly. People trusted this invisible labor because it had proven reliable over generations. There is understated humor in how little discussion surrounded this process. No one debated whether flooding was good or bad. That debate would have served no purpose. The flood arrived. People adjusted. Life continued. Flooding also reorganized social interaction. People gathered differently. Boats created proximity where paths had once separated. Conversations happened while drifting slowly. Time felt stretched but not wasted. With fewer tasks demanding urgency, attention softened. The flood did not create spectacle. It erased sharp boundaries. Fields blended into river. River blended into sky. This blending reduced the sense of division. When boundaries soften, conflict often does as well. Flooding encouraged cooperation simply by altering space. Storage areas became central during this time, checking seals, redistributing supplies, ensuring nothing spoiled. These tasks were repetitive and quiet. Repetition calmed nerves. Calm prevented mistakes. Mistakes during flooding were costly. The river's behavior during these weeks reinforced trust in sequence. First rise, then spread, then pause, then withdrawal. Each stage arrived without announcement. People noticed transitions through sensation rather than declaration. Coolness changed. Smell shifted. Texture altered. These cues mattered more than dates. Late-night history lingers here because flooding reveals how societies endure without dramatizing survival. The flood did not feel like interruption. It felt like continuation under different conditions. Continuation is rarely remembered because it lacks climax. There is calm in understanding that not all challenges require response. Some require accommodation. Flooding along the Nile was accommodated so thoroughly that it ceased to feel like challenge at all. It became background structure. People did not frame themselves as resilient. Resilience implies adversity. Here there was adjustment. Adjustment does not require praise, It requires awareness. As water lingered, movement slowed naturally. No one forced productivity. Productivity returned when conditions shifted. This patience prevented exhaustion. Exhaustion weakens systems. The river taught restraint by making haste impractical. Animals adjusted too. Grazing shifted to higher ground. Care routines changed slightly. These changes were not discussed. They were performed. Performance replaced planning. There is quiet irony in how modern minds, trained to expect disruption, struggle to imagine this steadiness. We associate flooding with disaster. Along the Nile, flooding was infrastructure. It delivered fertility without ceremony. Even conflict waited. Disputes paused when water made travel inconvenient. Decisions delayed until paths returned. This delay reduced escalation. Time softened edges. Flooding enforced patience without force. The river did not ask permission to flood. It did not justify itself. It arrived. People accepted this arrival as they accepted nightfall. Acceptance conserved energy. Energy preserved community. When water finally withdrew, no celebration marked its departure. That would have implied relief. Relief was unnecessary because nothing had been wrong. People simply shifted again. Boats were pulled aside. Paths re-emerged. Fields accepted seeds. Memory carried forward quietly. People remembered how this flood compared to others without recording it formally. Comparison lived in conversation and habit. Formal measurement was unnecessary. Experience sufficed. Late-night history finds rest in this absence of drama. Flooding as routine reveals a world where adaptation replaced anxiety. Life did not pause for interpretation. It moved through conditions fluidly. There is something deeply settling in knowing that a community can live inside a powerful force without naming it catastrophe or miracle. Naming often distorts experience. The Nile remained unnamed in that sense. It was simply the river doing what rivers do. Between centuries, flooding continued without acknowledging time's passage. This indifference to human chronology stabilized life. People measured seasons, not eras. They measured water depth, not dynasties. As night settled over flooded fields, reflections replaced outlines. The landscape looked different, but not unfamiliar. Familiarity does not require sameness. It requires recognition. People recognized the flood as part of themselves. No one told stories of heroism about these nights. They were ordinary. Ordinary nights rarely survive in records, but they sustain existence more reliably than extraordinary ones. The flood did not teach lessons loudly. It taught through repetition. Repeat enough times, and understanding embeds itself into movement. Movement becomes habit. Habit becomes culture. Late-night history stays with this quiet process because it resists drama. Flooding did not demand attention. It demanded alignment. Alignment was given, and so the river rose. People adjusted. Boats drifted. Fields rested. Work shifted. Time passed without announcement. Flooding remained routine, not drama, and because of that, life along the Nile continued with a steadiness that did not need to be remembered in order to endure. Water covered paths that would soon reappear. People did not mourn their temporary disappearance. They knew where they were. Memory filled the gaps. This trust in return shaped behavior. When nothing feels permanently lost, patience becomes easier. Houses were built with this in mind. Storage was raised. Thresholds were known. Flooding did not enter spaces it had not entered before. When it did, adjustments were made calmly. No one interpreted this as failure. It was information. Information guided future repairs. Sound changed during flooding. The slap of water replaced footsteps. Voices carried differently. These changes were not unsettling. They signaled adaptation. Adaptation was expected. Silence did not imply absence. It implied alignment with conditions. Work rhythms slowed slightly, but not because people lacked motivation. They slowed because water imposes its own pace. Fighting that pace would have exhausted bodies unnecessarily. The river rewarded those who matched it. Matching did not require speed. It required timing. Fields beneath water were not considered idle. They were resting. Rest here was productive. Silt settled. Nutrients distributed themselves without instruction. The land did work invisibly. People trusted this invisible labor because it had proven reliable over generations. There is understated humor in how little discussion surrounded this process. No one debated whether flooding was good or bad. That debate would have served no purpose. The flood arrived. People adjusted. Life continued. Flooding also reorganized social interaction. People gathered differently. Boats created proximity where paths had once separated. Conversations happened while drifting slowly. Time felt stretched but not wasted. With fewer tasks demanding urgency, attention softened. The flood did not create spectacle. It erased sharp boundaries. Fields blended into river. River blended into sky. This blending reduced the sense of division. When boundaries soften, conflict often does as well. Flooding encouraged cooperation simply by altering space. Storage areas became central during this time, checking seals, redistributing supplies, ensuring nothing spoiled. These tasks were repetitive and quiet. Repetition calmed nerves. Calm prevented mistakes. Mistakes during flooding were costly. The river's behavior during these weeks reinforced trust in sequence. First rise, then spread, then pause, then withdrawal. Each stage arrived without announcement. People noticed transitions through sensation rather than declaration. Coolness changed. Smell shifted. Texture altered. These cues mattered more than dates. Late-night history lingers here because flooding reveals how societies endure without dramatizing survival. The flood did not feel like interruption. It felt like continuation under different conditions. Continuation is rarely remembered because it lacks climax. There is calm in understanding that not all challenges require response. Some require accommodation. Flooding along the Nile was accommodated so thoroughly that it ceased to feel like challenge at all. It became background structure. People did not frame themselves as resilient. Resilience implies adversity. Here there was adjustment. Adjustment does not require praise. It requires awareness. As water lingered, movement slowed naturally. No one forced productivity. Productivity returned when conditions shifted. This patience prevented exhaustion. Exhaustion weakened systems. The river taught restraint by making haste impractical. Animals adjusted too. Grazing shifted to higher ground. Care routines changed slightly. These changes were not discussed. They were performed. Performance replaced planning. There is quiet irony in how modern minds, trained to expect disruption, struggle to imagine this steadiness. We associate flooding with disaster. Along the Nile, flooding was infrastructure. It delivered fertility without ceremony. Even conflict waited. Disputes paused when water made travel inconvenient. Decisions delayed until paths returned. This delay reduced escalation. Time softened edges. Flooding enforced patience without force. The river did not ask permission to flood. It did not justify itself. It arrived. People accepted this arrival as they accepted nightfall. Acceptance conserved energy. Energy preserved community. When water finally withdrew, no celebration marked its departure. That would have implied relief. Relief was unnecessary because nothing had been wrong. People simply shifted again. Boats were pulled aside. Paths re-emerged. Fields accepted seeds. Memory carried forward quietly. People remembered how this flood compared to others without recording it formally. Comparison lived in conversation and habit. Formal measurement was unnecessary. Experience sufficed. Late-night history finds rest in this absence of drama. Flooding as routine reveals a world where adaptation replaced anxiety. Life did not pause for interpretation. It moved through conditions fluidly. There is something deeply settling in knowing that a community can live inside a powerful force without naming it catastrophe or miracle. Naming often distorts experience. The Nile remained unnamed in that sense. It was simply the river doing what rivers do. Between centuries, flooding continued without acknowledging time's passage. This indifference to human chronology stabilized life. People measured seasons, not eras. They measured water depth, not dynasties. As night settled over flooded fields, reflections replaced outlines. The landscape looked different but not unfamiliar. Familiarity does not require sameness. It requires recognition. People recognized the flood as part of themselves. No one told stories of heroism about these nights. They were ordinary. Ordinary nights rarely survive in records, but they sustain existence more reliably than extraordinary ones. The flood did not teach lessons loudly. It taught through repetition. Repeat enough times and understanding embeds itself into movement. Movement becomes habit. Habit becomes culture. Late-night history stays with this quiet process because it resists drama. Flooding did not demand attention. It demanded alignment. Alignment was given. And so the river rose. People adjusted, boats drifted, fields rested, work shifted. Time passed without announcement. Flooding remained routine, not drama, and because of that, life along the Nile continued with a steadiness that did not need to be remembered in order to endure. Farmers who counted soil, not history. Farmers along the Nile did not experience their lives as chapters inside a larger story. They experienced them as surfaces under their hands. Success was measured by texture and color, by how soil responded when lifted, pressed, or crumbled between fingers. Dark soil meant continuity. It meant the flood had arrived properly, lingered long enough, and withdrawn with generosity. Pale soil meant effort ahead. It meant restraint, adjustment, and patience would be required. These assessments happened quietly, without ceremony, and without reference to anything beyond the ground itself. No one asked what century it was while standing in a field. No one measured time against empires while testing mud. Calendars existed, but they remained secondary to sensation. The land communicated directly. It spoke through smell after floodwater receded, through weight when baskets were lifted, through resistance when tools entered the earth. These signals mattered more than announcements from distant centers of power. Political authority existed somewhere else. Here, the land decided outcomes. Farmers discussed tools with more interest than rulers. A blade that dulled too quickly mattered more than a change in administration. An animal that tired early mattered more than a new decree. Storage conditions mattered more than ideology. Grain that kept well meant survival. Grain that spoiled meant loss. These realities shaped conversation and attention. History did not enter these calculations because it offered no guidance on planting depth or timing. Soil did. A good flood erased concern without requiring gratitude. It did not inspire speeches or reflection, it simply reduced anxiety. Reduced anxiety allowed people to work steadily rather than urgently. A weak flood did not provoke panic. It demanded restraint, fewer risks, smaller plantings, careful allocation of labor. These adjustments were not framed as hardship. They were framed as response. Response does not require explanation. Knowledge here was practical and cumulative. A farmer learned from the field rather than from instruction. Mistakes were remembered through yield, not through narrative. A poorly timed planting left its mark visibly. A well-judged decision rewarded patience quietly. Memory embedded itself into routine. Routine carried understanding forward without needing to name it. There is gentle irony in how historians later search these years for signs of awareness. Farmers were not unaware. They were focused. Focus narrowed attention deliberately. Attention placed elsewhere would have been wasteful. Waste threatened survival. Survival required alignment with land rather than abstraction. Fields after flood told their own stories. Dark soil glistened briefly before settling. Pale soil revealed where water had not lingered. These contrasts guided decisions more reliably than any record. Records can be lost. Soil remains underfoot. Farmers trusted what could be touched. The Nile created sameness across generations. A father's experience often mirrored his son's. Variations existed, but within known limits. This predictability reduced the need for long-term speculation. When next year resembles last year closely enough, planning becomes instinctive rather than strategic. Conversation during work reflected this orientation. People spoke about weather patterns, about how the water behaved compared to memory. They did not speak about who ruled upstream or downstream. Those questions did not change how soil felt. Feeling guided action more effectively than information. Tools carried memory as well. Handles smoothed by use remembered grip. Blades remembered angle. Repairs were made quietly, without complaint. A tool that lasted was valued more than a new one that promised improvement. Improvement was risky. Reliability was trusted. Animals were treated with similar pragmatism. An animal that worked well was cared for carefully. An animal that weakened prompted adjustment. Sentiment did not replace observation. Observation prevented loss. Loss narrowed options. Farmers avoided narrowing options whenever possible. There is understated humor in how little these lives intersected with the language of history. While officials debated authority, farmers debated timing. While borders shifted, fields remained where they were. Soil did not acknowledge conquest. It responded only to water and care. This focus created a particular calm. Anxiety often arises from forces perceived as uncontrollable, The Nile was powerful, but it was familiar. Familiar power feels less threatening than abstract power. Farmers accepted what they could not change and adjusted what they could. Storage was central to this worldview. Grain once harvested needed protection. Storage conditions mattered deeply: moisture, pests, airflow. These concerns dominated thought during quieter months. A full storehouse reduced fear more effectively than any promise. There was no nostalgia attached to this work. Nostalgia implies comparison with something lost. Here, continuity was assumed. The goal was not improvement beyond recognition. The goal was repetition with slight refinement. Refinement preserved stability. Children absorbed this perspective early. They learned to recognize soil conditions before learning stories. They learned when to wait and when to act. These lessons arrived through observation rather than instruction. Instruction can be ignored. Observation cannot. There is calm in understanding that not all knowledge seeks expansion. Some knowledge seeks sufficiency. Farmers aimed for enough food, enough strength, enough time. Excess ambition invited failure. Restraint preserved continuity. Even conflict was filtered through this lens. Disputes paused during critical agricultural moments. Planting required cooperation. Harvest required coordination. Conflict that disrupted these processes was postponed. The land enforced priority without argument. Late-night history rests here because this way of living resists drama. Nothing here builds toward climax. Days repeat with variation. Variation is absorbed rather than highlighted. This absorption allows endurance. The soil itself changed slowly. Layers built up over years. Farmers noticed subtle shifts without naming them as change. Change that arrives slowly does not demand interpretation. It demands adjustment. Political authority occasionally intruded through taxation or requisition. These moments were addressed pragmatically. Compliance where possible. Resistance where necessary. Neither reaction defined identity. Identity remained tied to land rather than rule. There is quiet irony in how little these farmers would have recognized themselves in later descriptions. They would not have described themselves as subjects of an era. They would have described themselves as people working land that behaved in familiar ways. Rest followed similar logic. After labor, rest was taken without ceremony. Rest was not a reward. It was maintenance. Maintenance kept bodies usable. Usability mattered more than morale. Seasons blurred together. Memory stored patterns rather than dates. Which flood felt higher? Which harvest felt easier? These impressions guided future decisions without requiring precise recall. Late-night history appreciates this absence of self-consciousness. A life lived without constant reference to significance often feels steadier from the inside. Steadiness allows sleep. As night settled over fields, farmers did not reflect on history. They reflected on fatigue. Fatigue indicated effort expended appropriately. Excess fatigue suggested miscalculation. The body provided feedback more honestly than any chronicle. Between 300 and 400 AD, many things shifted beyond the fields. Farmers noticed only what affected soil and storage. That narrow focus was not ignorance. It was survival optimized. There is something deeply settling in this perspective. When attention stays close to ground, anxiety has less room to grow. Abstract fears lose relevance. Immediate tasks provide structure. The Nile's rhythm reinforced this focus. Rise, spread, withdraw, repeat. Farmers matched their efforts to this sequence, matching reduced strain. Strain breaks systems faster than scarcity. Even disappointment was managed quietly. A weak flood did not inspire despair. It inspired caution. Caution guided planting decisions. Decisions shaped yield. Yield shaped winter. Late-night history stays with these farmers because their lives demonstrate how civilizations persist without awareness of themselves. Survival does not require interpretation. It requires alignment. Farmers counted soil, not history, because soil answered questions history could not. Soil told them whether effort would be rewarded. History offered no such clarity. As years passed, this focus sustained communities through uncertainty. While rulers changed and borders shifted, fields continued responding to water. That response anchored life. In sleep version telling, this feels gentle rather than harsh. Life unfolds without urgency. Decisions are made without spectacle. The land guides action calmly. There is mild humor in how unimportant historical labels would have seemed during planting. Labels do not soften soil. Hands do. Late at night, after tools were cleaned and animals settled, farmers rested without thinking about legacy. Rest arrived because work had been done sufficiently. The river would rise again. Soil would darken or not. Adjustments would follow. This expectation shaped calm. Farmers who counted soil, not history, lived inside a cycle that did not require attention to endure. It required care. Care was given. And because care continued, life along the Nile passed through these centuries quietly, without asking to be remembered, sustained by hands that trusted soil more than stories, and found the trust enough to sleep, wake, and begin again. Villages that adjusted instead of moved. Villages along the Nile rarely relocated, not because movement was impossible, but because movement was unnecessary. The river did not demand dramatic response. It demanded attention and patience. When water reached farther than expected, people did not abandon their homes. They repaired them. When banks softened, paths shifted a little. When storage risked dampness, it was carried uphill. These changes happened quietly, without discussion, and without the language of crisis. Adjustment felt sufficient. Relocation felt excessive. Homes were not treated as temporary structures awaiting replacement. They were treated as vessels that could be corrected. Walls were reinforced where water pressed harder. Foundations were raised incrementally rather than rebuilt. Materials were reused. Nothing was wasted unless it failed completely. This approach conserved effort and preserved familiarity. Familiarity reduced error. Error invited loss. Villages learned to prefer correction over replacement because correction preserved continuity. The river shaped behavior gradually, and people responded with equal slowness. Sudden decisions were rare. They introduced instability. Stability here emerged from restraint rather than control. Villages did not try to outthink the Nile, they watched it. Watching required time. Time allowed patterns to appear. Patterns guided small changes that accumulated into resilience. Paths tell this story clearly. A footpath rarely disappeared entirely. It bent. It drifted uphill or away from softened ground. Over years, the bend became normal. No one remembered the original straight line. The new route felt inevitable. This is how villages moved without moving. Direction changed while location remained. Storage reflected the same logic. Granaries were not rebuilt each season. Their contents shifted. Baskets were placed higher. Shelves were added. Floors were repaired. Elevation increased gradually rather than suddenly. This gradualism protected food and reduced panic. Panic wastes energy. Energy conserved, preserved life. There is gentle irony in how unimpressive this appears. Later observers might expect bold responses to environmental pressure. Villages responded with maintenance. Maintenance lacks drama, but extends survival. These communities understood that survival rarely rewards intensity. It rewards consistency. Social structures mirrored this physical adjustment. Households reorganized internally rather than dispersing. Sleeping arrangements changed. Storage areas moved. Workspaces shifted. No one announced these changes. They were noticed only when they worked. Function validated adjustment more convincingly than explanation ever could. The Nile did not punish villages that stayed. It required adaptation, not obedience. Villages learned which areas flooded briefly and which remained damp longer. They learned where to wait and where to intervene. Intervention was minimal. Excess intervention disturbed systems already working. There is understated humor in how little these villages believed in starting over. Starting over requires hope for improvement. Improvement felt uncertain. Adjustment felt reliable. People trusted what they could see. They could see walls. They could see paths. They could see storage. These elements responded predictably to care. Even when damage occurred, response remained measured. A collapsed wall was rebuilt with familiar technique. Materials were gathered locally. Labor was shared. No one framed the event as disaster. Disaster implies total loss. Loss here was partial and correctable. Children grew up learning this logic implicitly. They watched elders fix rather than flee. They learned where water lingered and where it drained. These lessons entered memory through repetition rather than instruction. Instruction fades. Repetition persists. Villages also adjusted socially. When certain tasks became harder, responsibilities shifted. Someone else fetched water, another tended animals. These shifts were temporary and fluid. Flexibility reduced strain. Strain fractures communities faster than scarcity. There is calm in knowing that one does not need to move to survive change. Change can be absorbed. Absorption requires patience and shared understanding. These villages cultivated both quietly. Late-night history lingers here because this form of resilience rarely enters narrative. Narratives prefer migration, collapse, or transformation. Adjustment looks like nothing happening. In reality, adjustment is work spread thinly across time. The built environment recorded these choices subtly. Layers of repair accumulated, walls thickened unevenly, floors rose slightly. These traces formed an archive of response. Anyone attentive could read past floods in architecture. No inscription was required. Villages did not seek optimal conditions. They sought tolerable ones. Tolerable conditions allowed life to continue without constant negotiation. Negotiation exhausts. Acceptance conserves. Even communal spaces reflected this mindset. Gathering areas shifted location seasonally. Shade structures moved. Nothing was fixed permanently unless proven reliable. Reliability emerged through use rather than design. There is mild irony in how often modern thought equates mobility with freedom. For these villages, staying put offered freedom from uncertainty. The land was known, the river was known. The unknown lay elsewhere. Authority rarely interfered in these adjustments. Officials measured yield, not methods. As long as food arrived, internal organization remained invisible. Invisibility protected autonomy. Villages preferred to remain unseen. Night brought no anxiety about rising water. People had learned what level required response. Below that, rest continued. Above that, quiet movement began. This threshold knowledge reduced fear. Fear thrives on uncertainty. Certainty existed here in degrees, not absolutes. There is something deeply soothing about this slow responsiveness. Life does not pivot suddenly. It bends. Bending preserves structure. Villages also understood when not to adjust. Over-adjustment wastes effort. Sometimes waiting revealed that no action was needed. Waiting required confidence in patterns. Patterns had proven reliable over generations. Late-night history appreciates this patience. It resists the urge to dramatize survival. Survival here looks like maintenance, correction, and restraint. As centuries passed, some villages eventually did move, but movement came after long periods of adjustment. Adjustment delayed displacement. Delay preserved memory and community. Memory matters. When villages stay, relationships remain intact. Shared history remains useful. Movement fractures these bonds. Fracture introduces risk. Villages avoided unnecessary risk. Even language reflected this stability. Place names persisted. Boundaries shifted slightly but remained recognizable. Identity stayed anchored. There is understated humor in how little anyone celebrated this endurance. Celebration implies achievement. Endurance was assumed. It required no applause. Work continued season after season. Adjustments became habit. Habit reduced cognitive load. Reduced load freed attention for immediate tasks. Children inherited a landscape shaped by countless small decisions. They did not know which adjustments had been made. They experienced the result as normal. Normality is the quiet triumph of adaptation. Villages that adjusted inward did not imagine themselves as resilient. They imagined themselves as practical. Practicality proved sufficient. Late-night history rests here because nothing asks to be remembered. These villages did not leave dramatic traces. They left continuity. Even when floods weakened or strengthened, response remained proportionate. Proportion prevented exhaustion. Exhaustion leads to abandonment. Villages stayed because they did not burn themselves out responding to every change. As night settles, homes stand where they stood before. Paths curve gently. Storage rests higher than last generation. Nothing announces success. Success appears as absence of crisis. Villages along the Nile survived long stretches of uncertainty by refusing to move unless movement became unavoidable. Until then, they adjusted. Adjustment preserved place. Place preserved memory. There is calm in recognizing that stability can come from staying rather than fleeing. Staying requires trust. Trust here was earned through repetition. Late-night history stays with these villages because they demonstrate a form of endurance that does not require strength or speed. It requires attention, patience, and willingness to correct rather than escape. The river continues. Villages continue. Neither insists on explanation. Villages that adjusted instead of moved carried life forward quietly, one repaired wall at a time, one shifted path at a time, finding that staying, when done carefully, was enough to outlast centuries that expected motion and to sleep each night without fear that tomorrow would demand a completely different place to stand. Labor that followed water, not power. Work did not wake up to orders. It woke up to the sound of water changing its mind. Long before anyone counted years or named rains, labor learned to listen sideways, not upward. It learned to watch the river more closely than officials, to feel the ground under bare feet, to notice when mud softened and when it tightened again. In these places, schedules were not printed or announced. They arrived quietly, carried by the current, and everyone understood them without discussion. When the river rose, work changed shape. Fields disappeared, but effort did not. Hands moved from planting to repair, from scattering seed to checking walls, clearing channels, lifting tools to higher ground. There was no confusion about this shift. No one asked who approved it. Water covered the land, so labor followed elsewhere. This logic felt so ordinary that it barely registered as a decision. It was simply how days rearranged themselves. Power existed, of course. Someone collected grain. Someone counted storage jars. Someone wrote marks on tablets or knotted cords to remember quantities. But this authority arrived later, after the river had finished speaking. It waited patiently because it had no other option. The water did not respond to summons. It did not delay for ceremonies. It did not care if the calendar said it was early or late. Labor knew this. Authority learned it repeatedly. During flood season, the rhythm slowed and widened. Days were less about urgency and more about continuity. People worked along embankments, strengthening what had softened, redigging channels that had silted up. They carried baskets of mud, not with panic, but with the mild focus of those who understood the task would return next year and the year after that. There was no illusion that this work ended anything permanently. It merely kept the agreement intact for another cycle. Planting waited without resentment. Seeds were patient because people were patient. No one stood at the edge of submerged fields demanding exceptions. There was no appeal process for water. The river had already decided, and arguing with it would have been like arguing with nightfall. Labor adjusted its posture instead. It learned to bend seasonally the way reeds do, without calling the motion surrender. When the water withdrew, it did so unevenly. Some patches dried first, others lingered in dampness. Labor returned in fragments, not in unison. People tested the soil with toes and fingers. They pressed clumps, smelled them, listened to the sound made when earth broke apart. Planting began not on a date, but at a texture. This subtlety was never written down, yet it was taught constantly, absorbed through repetition rather than instruction. Authority watched all of this with a certain practiced restraint. It knew better than to interrupt. Grain could not be demanded before grain existed. Taxes made sense only after growth had happened. Power learned patience the way everyone else did, though perhaps with less elegance. It waited for the river to finish its work, then stepped forward with baskets and measures, pretending it had been in charge all along. This quiet irony was not lost on anyone. People understood who decided first. They did not say it out loud because it did not need saying. The river was not a rival to power. It was the framework within which power learned its limits. Anyone who forgot this was corrected quickly, not by rebellion, but by another flood, arriving exactly on its own terms. Labor, meanwhile, remained flexible. It did not romanticize hardship, but it did not dramatize it either. Work was work. Some days it meant hauling mud. Other days it meant long hours bent over seedlings. During flood months, tasks clustered communally. During planting seasons, they dispersed. This movement felt less like organization and more like breathing. Expansion and contraction, again and again, without commentary. There was humor in this, though it stayed quiet. Officials might announce plans, but everyone knew those plans were provisional. A particularly stubborn bend in the river could erase weeks of preparation without apology. People learned to smile at this, not bitterly, but with a resigned amusement. Water, after all, had never claimed to be reasonable. Expecting consistency from it would have been the real mistake. Over time, this arrangement shaped thinking itself. Work was not measured by hours, but by alignment. A good Labor Day was one that matched conditions. A bad day was not a failure of effort, but a misreading of timing. This reduced anxiety in subtle ways. There was always something to do, but rarely something to force. Labor followed cues rather than commands, and this made endurance possible. Children absorbed this logic early. They watched adults change tasks without complaint. They learned that productivity was seasonal, not moral. No one was praised for planting during floods or shamed for resting when fields were inaccessible. Rest had its place, just as labor did. Both were responses, not virtues. The river, indifferent and steady, set the tone. When authority finally entered the scene with record-keeping and collection, it did so carefully. It knew the harvest depended on having respected the river's sequence. Power that arrived too early risked empty granaries later. So it waited, counted after the fact, and spoke in the language of totals rather than commands. Even then, it never truly led. It followed, just at a more formal distance. This order was never questioned because it never needed defense. It worked. Year after year, labor aligned with water, and society held together quietly because of it. There were no speeches about balance, no slogans about harmony, just repetition, adjustment, and an unspoken agreement that the river went first. At night, when work ended and the land settled, this logic lingered in the body. Muscles relaxed, knowing tomorrow's task would be clear when morning arrived. There was comfort in not having to decide everything in advance. The river would indicate what mattered. Labor would respond. Authority would catch up later, as it always did. In this way, work became less about obedience and more about attention. Attention to water level, soil smell, the speed of drying mud. This attentiveness produced stability without rigidity. It allowed life to continue without insisting on control. Power, for all its structures, remained secondary, a note written in the margins of a much older text. And so labor slept well. It had listened all day. It had followed something real. Tomorrow the river would speak again, softly or loudly, and work would rise to meet it, unhurried, amused, and entirely unconcerned with who claimed credit afterward. Food as memory, not symbol. Grain stored along the Nile was never asked to perform. It did not stand for greatness, prosperity, or divine favor. It was not arranged to impress visitors or reassure rulers. It simply waited. In low rooms, built to stay cool, grain rested in baskets and jars, quiet and patient, doing the one job it had always been given. It held time together. That was all. Storage rooms were not places of spectacle. They were dim, practical, and deliberately dull. Walls were thick. Light entered reluctantly. The air smelled faintly of dust and dried husks, a smell that never surprised anyone. People entered these spaces without ceremony, counted what needed counting, adjusted what needed adjusting, and left. No one lingered to admire abundance. No one mourned scarcity out loud. The grain did not ask for attention, and attention was not offered. This absence of drama was intentional, even if no one would have described it that way. To dramatize food would have been to misunderstand its purpose. Grain existed to bridge seasons, not emotions. It connected one harvest to the next, one flood cycle to the following year. It was not a trophy. It was a promise made quietly and kept without witnesses. Counting occurred regularly, but never theatrically. Hands moved over baskets, measures were repeated, marks were made. The process was careful but unremarkable. There were no speeches announcing totals, no public relief or anxiety attached to numbers. Knowing was enough. Displaying knowledge would have added nothing. The grain did not change based on how loudly it was discussed. Food in this system carried memory rather than meaning. Each jar represented a past season that had gone well enough. Each basket held the echo of water rising at the right moment, receding without violence, leaving soil ready. People did not personify this memory. They did not thank the grain or blame it. They simply recognized it as the residue of continuity. Because of this, abundance felt calm rather than exciting. A full storehouse did not inspire celebration. It inspired routine. Work continued. Meals remained measured. There was no urge to consume more simply because more existed. Eating followed habit, not inventory. This restraint was not moral. It was practical. Food that disappeared too quickly would not do its job later. Scarcity, when it arrived, was treated with the same restraint. A thinner storehouse did not trigger panic. Portions adjusted. Expectations narrowed. People trusted that the next cycle would arrive because it always had. Anxiety would not make food appear faster. Quiet adaptation was more effective. The grain seemed to approve of this approach by continuing to last just long enough. Meals reflected this attitude. They were steady, predictable, rarely indulgent. Food tasted of work rather than luxury. Eating was not rushed, but neither was it prolonged. Meals ended when hunger ended, not when plates were empty. This consistency trained the body to expect continuity rather than excess. Memory lived in repetition, not novelty. Children learned early that food was not a reward or a symbol of success. It was a condition of tomorrow. They watched adults measure portions without commentary, store grain without pride, and plan meals without anxiety. These lessons were not taught explicitly. They were absorbed, like the rhythm of the river, through exposure and repetition. Authority interacted with food carefully. It counted, allocated, and redistributed when necessary, but it did not turn storage into performance. Power understood that grain worked best when left alone. A storehouse was successful precisely because it remained unremarkable. The moment food became symbolic, it risked becoming unstable. Symbols invited competition. Grain preferred cooperation. There was quiet irony in this restraint. From a distance, outsiders might have assumed that such careful storage indicated obsession with wealth. In reality, it indicated the opposite. Food mattered too much to be turned into display. It was protected from attention the way fragile things are protected, not hidden out of shame, but kept safe from interference. Season after season, the same actions repeated. Grain entered storage, grain left storage. The cycle continued without commentary. This repetition created a collective memory that did not rely on stories. People remembered past years, not through tales of feasts or famines, but through the steady presence of meals that had arrived on time. At night, storage rooms stayed silent. No guards dramatized their duty. No rituals marked the passing of months. Grain slept, if such a thing can be said, and people slept knowing it was there. This knowledge was not exciting. It was reassuring in the most minimal way. Nothing special was happening, and that was precisely the point. Food's refusal to symbolize anything grand allowed society to remain stable. There was no pressure to prove success through consumption, no expectation that leaders demonstrate power by excess. Meals did not change with politics. Grain did not respond to ambition. It responded only to time, moisture, and care. In this way, food became a record of restraint. Each surviving season testified not to triumph, but to balance. The memory it carried was not emotional. It was procedural. This is how much we stored. This is how long it lasted. This is how we adjusted. The record existed in practice, not in narrative. Over generations, this approach shaped thinking. People trusted processes more than promises. They believed in preparation rather than proclamation. Food taught this lesson without speaking. It simply remained available when needed, assuming it had been left undisturbed long enough to do so. There was a kind of quiet humor in watching others misunderstand this. Visitors might expect grand granaries or ceremonial distribution. They found instead plain rooms and calm routines. Nothing was hidden, but nothing was emphasized either. The lack of spectacle confused those accustomed to symbolic abundance. Locals did not bother explaining. The grain did not require translation. As seasons passed, memory accumulated without nostalgia. No one romanticized past harvests. They remembered them only insofar as they informed present storage. The past mattered because it had worked, not because it was glorious. Food reinforced this attitude by being useful rather than inspiring. When a new harvest arrived, it did not erase the old one. It joined it. Grain mixed with grain. Time layered itself quietly. Storage rooms became archives without labels, holding years together without distinction. This blending discouraged fixation on any single season. Continuity mattered more than origin. In the end, food succeeded by refusing significance. It did not demand gratitude or fear. It did not offer identity. It offered passage. From one season to the next, from one year to another, grain did its work invisibly. And because it was treated as memory rather than symbol, it endured, quietly, amused perhaps, that anyone ever thought it needed to mean more than this. Trade that drifted with current. Trade did not hurry because the river did not hurry. Boats waited in the shallows, tied loosely, listening to water more than to voices. Merchants learned early that movement was permission-based, not scheduled. The current decided when travel made sense, and everyone involved understood this without needing it explained. There were no deadlines written into contracts that water could not read. Goods stayed where they were until the river agreed to carry them, and this agreement arrived quietly, without announcement. When the current strengthened, boats slipped forward almost accidentally. When it weakened, they rested. This was not considered inefficiency. It was considered realism. Cargo did not spoil because it waited. People did not panic because arrival took longer than expected. Time expanded to match distance. Trade became something that happened within patience rather than against it, and the river enforced this expectation better than any rule ever could. Goods moved slowly, and no one pretended otherwise. Grain sacks absorbed moisture and dried again. Clay jars knocked gently against one another. Wood darkened, fibers softened, edges wore smooth. By the time items reached their destination, they already carried the river's memory. This wear was not damage. It was proof of passage. A thing that arrived too clean was suspicious, as if it had not truly traveled. Markets adapted without complaint. Prices adjusted to delays. Availability shifted seasonally. Buyers expected absence as much as presence. A missing shipment was not a crisis. It was a reminder that water was having its turn. Merchants learned to explain delays with a simple shrug rather than elaborate excuses. Everyone already knew the reason. The river had paused. Conversation ended there. There was mild irony in watching policy trail behind this reality. Decrees about trade routes and supply flows existed, written carefully and announced confidently. They sounded impressive, but they remained theoretical until the current cooperated. A strong edict could not push a boat upstream against resistance. Authority learned to phrase its ambitions softly, aware that water would interpret them freely. This limitation preserved calm in subtle ways. Because speed was naturally capped, ambition stayed moderate. There was no obsession with expansion for its own sake. Growth happened incrementally, paced by geography rather than desire. Merchants planned broadly, not precisely. They knew success depended less on clever timing and more on waiting well. This reduced anxiety in a way no regulation ever managed. Trade routes were not arteries pumping urgency. They were slow veins carrying necessity. Boats passed one another without competition. Overtaking was rare and unnecessary. Everyone would arrive eventually or not at all, and either outcome was acceptable. There was no reward for being first when storage and demand were stable. Markets valued reliability over speed, and reliability came from respecting the river's limits. Delays became social spaces rather than failures. Crews repaired ropes, shared meals, traded stories. Boats tied together temporarily, forming floating neighborhoods that existed only until the current shifted. News traveled slowly as well, filtered through repetition rather than broadcast. By the time information arrived, it had lost its sharp edges and gained context. This made it easier to live with. Merchants did not measure success by distance covered per day. They measured it by safe arrival and intact cargo. A journey that took longer than expected but ended well was considered good. A fast journey that risked damage was considered foolish. This shared understanding discouraged recklessness without needing enforcement. The river rewarded caution naturally and punished haste impersonally. There was quiet humor in watching impatience fail repeatedly. A newcomer might attempt to push harder, to row aggressively against a weak current, only to exhaust themselves and move nowhere. The river corrected such behavior gently but firmly. Those who learned laughed at themselves later. Those who did not eventually left trade altogether. No one missed them much. Because movement was slow, accumulation remained local. Warehouses filled gradually. Surpluses were visible and finite. This made hoarding less tempting and scarcity less frightening. When goods were late, people waited. When goods arrived, they were distributed with an understanding of the effort involved. Consumption followed availability rather than aspiration, which kept expectations aligned with reality. The absence of urgency also shaped trust. Contracts were flexible because they had to be. Everyone involved understood the promises depended on water. This mutual awareness reduced conflict. Disputes were rare and usually short. There was no point in arguing with someone who was already waiting alongside you, watching the same current refuse to move. At night, boats rested completely still. The river smoothed itself into a reflective surface, erasing signs of motion. Trade slept then without guilt. No one counted lost hours. Darkness was part of the system, just as necessary as flow. When morning came, the river would decide again. Boats would follow. Markets would adjust. Nothing urgent needed to be resolved before then. Over time, this rhythm shaped economic thinking itself. Value was tied to durability rather than speed. Goods designed for river trade were sturdy, repairable, forgiving. Fragile items were rare or carefully protected. This practicality extended beyond objects into behavior. People learned to wait without resentment, to accept delay as information rather than obstruction. Policy eventually learned to imitate this tone. Official language softened. Expectations widened. Plans included margins for water's unpredictability. Authority stopped pretending it controlled movement and began framing itself as supportive instead. This was not humility in the moral sense. It was adaptation. Power that refused to adapt simply became irrelevant. The river, meanwhile, remained indifferent to all of this learning. It flowed when it flowed and rested when it rested. Trade drifted with it, unhurried and intact. This drifting preserved calm, not because it was peaceful, but because it was honest. It did not promise more than it could deliver. It did not rush toward a future that could not arrive faster anyway. In the end, trade survived precisely because it accepted limitation. Speed was not an achievement. Expansion was not a goal. Continuity mattered more than volume. Boats came and went. Goods circulated slowly. Markets breathed in and out. And through it all, the river continued to set the pace, quietly amused, perhaps, that anyone ever thought policy might do better. Childhood. Shaped by repetition. Children did not begin with stories. They began with patterns. Long before they understood names, titles, or explanations, they learned sequences. Light arrived, heat followed, water changed its mood, and adults adjusted without complaint. This was the first education delivered quietly, without lessons or correction. The river did not explain itself, and no one tried to translate it for them. Watching was enough. Seasons arrived before language settled. A child learned the feel of damp ground before learning the word for soil. They learned the smell of rising water before understanding what flood meant. Their calendars were not counted in months, but in sensations. The air thickened. The mornings cooled. Shadows shifted. These cues repeated reliably, and repetition made them familiar rather than alarming. Adults rarely announced what was happening. They did not gather children to explain the logic of water or labor. They simply moved when movement was required and waited when waiting made sense. Children observed this without commentary. They saw hands change tasks, saw tools lifted and set aside, saw paths disappear and reappear. No one framed these changes as disruptions. They were treated as adjustments, and children absorbed that tone effortlessly. In this way, endurance was learned without instruction. There were no speeches about resilience, no warnings about hardship. Endurance appeared as normal behavior, Adults woke up, noticed conditions, and acted accordingly. Children saw that no one argued with the river, and more importantly, no one seemed injured by accepting its terms. This quiet acceptance carried more weight than any advice ever could. Play followed the same logic. Games shifted locations with water levels. Paths that vanished became new boundaries rather than losses. Children adapted without mourning what was temporarily unavailable. They learned early that absence did not mean failure, it meant later. This understanding reduced frustration before it had a chance to grow into expectation. Names arrived slowly and almost incidentally. By the time children learned to label things, they already knew how those things behaved. Words described what experience had already taught. This made language feel secondary rather than authoritative. The river mattered more than its name. The season mattered more than its explanation. Knowledge came from exposure, not from instruction. Adults rarely corrected children's interpretations unless safety required it. Misunderstandings sorted themselves out through repetition. If a child expected dry ground too early, they learned otherwise by stepping into mud. The lesson did not require scolding. The ground was persuasive enough. Over time, prediction improved, not through memorization, but through familiarity. History lessons were unnecessary in this environment. The past was not narrated as a sequence of events, but embedded in routine. Children learned what had happened before by seeing what adults prepared for. Reinforced embankments told stories of previous water levels. Storage habits hinted at earlier shortages. Nothing was dramatized. The past remained present through habits rather than memory. Because of this, children did not grow up expecting novelty. Change existed, but it followed recognizable paths. This predictability reduced anxiety. Even when conditions were difficult, they were rarely surprising. The river did not trick anyone. It repeated itself with slight variations. Enough to require attention, not enough to demand fear. There was mild irony in how little explanation was offered. Outsiders might have assumed children were being neglected intellectually. In reality, they were being trained continuously. Observation replaced instruction. Consistency replaced narrative. The river taught more effectively than any story because it never contradicted itself in important ways. As children grew older, their participation increased naturally. They were not told when they were ready. They simply found themselves doing more, carrying lighter loads, helping with smaller tasks, watching where adults stepped and stepping there too. This gradual involvement felt inevitable rather than assigned. Responsibility arrived quietly, the way water receded, revealing new ground. Mistakes were tolerated as part of learning. A misjudged step into shallow water was corrected by wet feet, not by reprimand. A forgotten tool was retrieved later. These errors were not moralized. They were treated as information. Children learned quickly because consequences were immediate but not exaggerated. Storytelling existed, but it was not instructional. Stories filled evenings, not schedules. They entertained more than they taught. Moral lessons were subtle or absent. No one relied on stories to transmit survival knowledge. That knowledge was visible daily. Stories softened the edges of time rather than defining behavior. Through repetition, children learned patience almost accidentally. Waiting was normal. Delays were expected. If something did not happen today, it would happen later, or not at all. Both outcomes were acceptable. This acceptance shaped temperament. Urgency did not become default. Anticipation did not turn into frustration. The river reinforced this calm by remaining indifferent. It did not respond to excitement or fear. It did not reward eagerness. Children learned quickly that emotional intensity did not influence outcomes. Attention did. This distinction mattered. It encouraged quiet observation over dramatic reaction. As years passed, memory formed, without emphasis. Children remembered previous seasons not because they were told to, but because patterns repeated. This repetition created familiarity without nostalgia. The past mattered only insofar as it resembled the present. There was little temptation to romanticize what had already happened. The future looked much the same, and that was comforting. Adults did not shield children from work, but neither did they burden them with explanation. They trusted repetition to do its work. This trust was rewarded. By the time children reached adulthood, they required little instruction. They already knew how to watch, how to wait, how to adjust. Formal education, where it existed, sat lightly on top of this foundation. It added names and dates, but did not replace the deeper knowledge of pattern. Children understood consistency before chronology. They knew what returned and what did not. This understanding proved more durable than facts. There was quiet humor in how confidently children navigated complexity without vocabulary. They could predict water behavior with accuracy while still struggling to articulate reasons. Adults rarely corrected this. Precision of action mattered more than precision of speech. The river did not require explanation to cooperate. At night, children fell asleep having watched a full day of adjustment. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No lessons had been announced. Yet learning had happened continuously. The river had demonstrated consistency again. Adults had responded calmly again. This repetition sank in, deeper than words ever could. In the end, childhood here was shaped not by stories of the past, but by the reliability of the present. The river taught consistency without speaking. Adults modeled endurance without naming it. Children learned seasons before stories, patterns before names, and patience before ambition. And because of this, history lessons were unnecessary. The river had already taught them everything they needed to know, again and again, quietly enough that it felt like rest. A year that left. No trace. Between 300 and 400 AD, many years passed without insisting on being remembered. They arrived, unfolded, and departed with little resistance. Nothing collapsed loudly enough to demand attention. Nothing emerged dramatically enough to require a beginning. Time moved forward, but it did so sideways, blending one day into the next, until even the people living inside it stopped noticing the edges. For those who came later, this stretch of time would appear suspiciously empty. Historians would lean closer, expecting a turning point, a decline, a spark of transformation. They would search for signals and fragments, for reasons to explain why nothing seemed to happen. But for those who lived through these years, the absence of meaning was not a problem. It was the condition that allowed life to continue without interruption. A year like this did not announce itself. It did not arrive with promises or warnings. It simply began on a morning much like the one before it. People woke, noticed the light, felt the air, and continued with tasks already familiar. The year did not interrupt routines to make itself known. It slipped into place quietly, as if it preferred not to be noticed at all. Nothing collapsing meant nothing needed to be repaired urgently. Walls still stood, fields still produced, paths remained usable. This lack of disaster created a strange invisibility. Without urgency, there was no narrative. Without narrative, memory thinned. People did not mark the year as different because it offered no reason to do so. Nothing beginning meant no anticipation gathered around it. There was no sense of arrival. No one felt they were standing at the threshold of something new. Innovations, if they occurred, were incremental and unannounced. A tool adjusted slightly. A habit shifted almost imperceptibly. Change happened, but it refused to pose for attention. The year dissolved into routine, not because routine was dull, but because it was sufficient. Days were full enough to occupy attention, but not intense enough to require reflection. Work was done. Meals were eaten. Nights arrived. Sleep followed. This sequence repeated with enough consistency to feel complete. Later historians would find this unsettling. A year without events challenges the desire to organize time into chapters. It resists summary. It offers no clear lesson. From the outside, such a year appears empty. From the inside, it feels stable. Stability, however, rarely leaves traces dramatic enough to survive documentation. People living inside the year did not experience it as absence. They experienced it as continuity. The lack of disruption allowed focus to remain narrow and local. Attention stayed on immediate needs rather than abstract futures. This narrowed focus did not feel limiting. It felt appropriate. Memory requires contrast. Without sharp edges, it fades. The year offered few contrasts. Seasons followed expected patterns. Variations were small enough to be absorbed without remark. A slightly later flood. A slightly cooler night. These differences registered briefly, then vanished into repetition. No one stopped to say this year feels important. There was no reason to. Importance usually arrives attached to consequences. This year avoided them. It neither punished nor rewarded excessively. It asked little beyond participation. Participation was already happening. Authority continued to exist, but it did not intrude. Taxes were collected. Records were kept. None of this disrupted daily life enough to warrant memory. Administration functioned best when it remained background noise. During these years, it succeeded. Religion, where present, followed familiar rhythms. Rituals repeated without innovation. Festivals occurred on schedule. Nothing demanded reinterpretation. Belief systems prefer drama, but they can tolerate calm. During this year, calm prevailed. Trade continued at its usual pace. Goods arrived late or early within expected margins. Markets adjusted without comment. No shortages forced explanation. No surpluses demanded celebration. Economic life maintained a steady hum, audible but unremarkable. Children born during this year grew without knowing it was different. They learned routines that had already existed. They inherited habits rather than moments. Later, when asked about the year of their birth, no one could say much. The year did not offer a story to attach to them. A year like this resists being dated emotionally. People might remember individual days within it, but not the year as a whole. It did not leave a distinct taste. It blended into neighboring years, indistinguishable in retrospect. From a distance, this blending becomes a problem. Historical timelines prefer distinction. They ask when something happened. A year that answers nothing challenges that framework. It sits between events, uncooperative and quiet. For those living inside it, this quiet was not emptiness. It was relief. A year without collapse meant energy could be conserved. Attention could remain inward. Life did not need to be narrated constantly. It could simply be lived. The absence of beginnings meant fewer expectations. Without a sense of starting point, there was no pressure to progress. People did not measure themselves against imagined futures. They measured days by completion rather than advancement. Time during this year felt wide rather than sharp. Weeks passed without urgency. Months slipped by without accumulation of significance. The calendar advanced, but the body felt steady. This steadiness reduced anxiety in ways that rarely make it into records. Later historians might assume stagnation. This assumption misunderstands the nature of routine. Routine is not static. It is active maintenance. Things continue because effort is applied consistently. That effort, however, is rarely spectacular. A year that leaves no trace is often the result of many small successes. Fields held, water behaved, tools lasted, relationships endured. None of these successes demanded attention because they were expected. Expectation erases memory. When people looked back, even a few years later, they struggled to separate this year from others. It had no defining feature. It did not stand out in conversation. It required no explanation. This forgettability was not failure. It was evidence of balance. At night, people slept. Without sensing they were inside a blank space of history. They slept because the day had been full enough. Dreams did not carry symbols of collapse or renewal. They carried fragments of routine. The year passed. Another arrived. No one marked the transition with significance. The boundary blurred. Life continued, indifferent to later curiosity. For historians, this year would become a gap. For those who lived it, it was simply time. Time that did not demand attention. Time that did not insist on meaning. Meaning, after all, is often imposed later. Those inside the year were too busy living to extract it. They did not know they were being unremarkable. They did not care. The irony is quiet. Years remembered often involve suffering or upheaval. Years forgotten often involve competence. This year avoided memory by functioning well enough. In the long arc between 300 and 400 AD, such years accumulated quietly. They formed the bulk of lived experience. They supported the few dramatic moments that would later dominate records. A year that left no trace did its work invisibly. It held life steady. It asked for nothing. It offered no lesson. And because of that, it passed unnoticed, which was perhaps its greatest success. Why the Nile never needed attention. The Nile never asked to be explained because it never behaved like a mystery. It did not arrive suddenly, vanish unexpectedly, or reinvent itself to demand interpretation. It moved, and then it moved again, in ways that could be anticipated with patience rather than brilliance. People did not gather to debate its meaning. They watched it instead. Observation replaced explanation early, and once that habit settled in, attention drifted elsewhere. The river did not compete for notice. It simply continued, and that continuation proved sufficient. Its power came from repetition rather than force. A flood that arrives every year does not shock anyone. It instructs quietly. Each return confirms the last one. Over time, repetition builds trust, and trust dulls fascination. The Nile did not overwhelm the senses. It trained them. People learned its moods, not because they were dramatic, but because they were consistent enough to be learned without fear. The river's strength lay in being predictable enough to be ignored. Authority followed the same pattern. The Nile did not demand obedience. It demonstrated reliability. When water rose, soil renewed itself. When it withdrew, planting followed. This sequence did not need justification. It worked. Reliability produces authority more effectively than command, and the river mastered this without effort. No announcement was necessary. The result spoke every season. Empires nearby rose with speeches, symbols, and ambition. They softened with equal ceremony, leaving behind ruins and explanations. The Nile watched none of this. It did not mark dynasties or record reigns. It measured time through motion. Water levels mattered more than rulers. This indifference made the river durable. Attention shifts. Reliability remains. Because the Nile did not change abruptly, it did not invite anxiety. Anxiety thrives on unpredictability. Here there was little of it. Variation existed, but within bounds. People prepared not for surprises, but for adjustments. This lowered the emotional temperature of life along the river. When nothing demands urgent interpretation, thought slows. Calm spreads. Stories struggled to attach themselves to such steadiness. Narratives prefer conflict, transformation, and rupture. The Nile offered none of these reliably enough. As a result, it slipped out of storytelling frameworks. People spoke about it only when necessary. It was present in everything but centered in nothing. This made it powerful in an untheatrical way. Work aligned with this tone. Labor followed patterns set by water, not by rhetoric. There was no incentive to dramatize effort when outcomes were known. Planting happened, maintenance followed, rest arrived. The river did not reward excitement. It rewarded timing. Over time, people learned to mirror this restraint. Memory behaved differently here. Instead of recalling singular moments, people remembered sequences. Not what happened once, but what happened every year. This form of memory resists narration. It lives in habit. The Nile encouraged this by repeating itself faithfully. People stopped asking why and focused on when. Empires required attention to survive. They needed recognition, loyalty, belief. The river required none of these. It endured because it did not depend on agreement. It flowed regardless of interpretation. Those who aligned with it prospered quietly. Those who ignored it were corrected without malice. There was subtle irony in how little credit the river received. It sustained life while avoiding admiration. Monuments rose nearby dedicated to power that would fade. The Nile remained uncelebrated by comparison, yet indispensable. Its refusal to seek attention protected it from disappointment. At night, the river reflected stars without comment. It did not amplify their meaning. It accepted them as temporary. This acceptance echoed in human behavior. People slept without wondering whether the river approved. Approval was irrelevant. Continuity mattered more. When change eventually arrived, it did so gradually. Even shifts that altered the river's behavior unfolded slowly enough to be absorbed. Abrupt change would have forced attention. Gradual change dissolved into routine. The Nile's pace prevented panic by preventing shock. Explanation often arises from insecurity. When systems fail, people explain them. When systems endure, explanation feels unnecessary. The Nile endured. Its reliability answered questions before they were asked. Silence became the appropriate response. Time along the river felt circular rather than linear. Years resembled one another closely enough to blur. This blurring reduced the impulse to measure progress aggressively. Progress existed, but it did not announce itself. It accumulated quietly, like silt. Those who lived there rarely spoke of the river's greatness. Greatness implies comparison. The Nile did not compete, it simply remained. Comparison requires alternatives. There were none that mattered. Later observers struggled with this. They wanted to assign significance. They asked why the Nile mattered so much. The answer was disappointingly simple. It mattered because it stayed the same long enough to be trusted. Attention is often given to what might disappear. The Nile did not threaten to leave. It did not dramatize its presence. It endured by refusing to demand notice. In the end, the Nile never needed attention because attention implies uncertainty. The river offered none. It measured time by motion rather than memory, by repetition rather than declaration. Empires rose and softened nearby, leaving traces for historians to examine. The river continued unbothered, enduring precisely because it never asked to be understood. When a year passes without asking permission. As the year ends, nothing announces completion. There is no ceremony, no pause for reflection, no sense that something has been finished properly. Water lowers in its own time. Fields dry without applause. Storage rooms fill and fall silent again. People rest, not because they have achieved something, but because the body recognizes a moment when effort can soften. The Nile does not stop to admire itself. It does not review its performance. It simply shifts, preparing quietly for the next cycle, unconcerned with memory or praise. This is where late-night history chooses to remain. Not at the moment of collapse and not at the moment of triumph, but in the long middle where most lives actually unfold. Here, days do not demand interpretation. They repeat gently enough to disappear from attention. Habits replace events. Adjustments replace decisions. Meaning, if it appears at all, arrives accidentally after the fact, and rarely stays long enough to be named. There is mild humor in this. The quiet irony that what sustains life best is often what leaves the least trace. The river flows without asking permission. The year passes without requesting significance. No one feels obligated to explain why this feels sufficient. Work will return. Water will rise again. Fields will darken. Storage will empty slowly. Rest will be followed by motion, and motion by rest, without announcement. Nothing concludes, nothing begins. Continuity simply carries on, indifferent to observation. And so the closing does not close, it fades. The river keeps moving. The calendar advances. Life remains steady enough to be forgettable, which is perhaps its greatest kindness. When a year passes like this, unnoticed and intact, it has done exactly what was required of it, and nothing more. Without ceremony or witnesses,